If you sacrificed everything you had for something, how far would you go to keep it? His House is a 2020 movie about a couple seeking asylum from Sudan into England, and while staying at a government issued house, uncover a dark force. Now, first off, I want to say this was an interesting take on the horror movie trope of a couple or a family that moves into a new home that turns out to be haunted. It actually twists in two ways, one of which I'll only talk about in the spoiler section. But in the initial way, though, is that this couple did not buy some old house or get it in an auction or inherit it. With this, they were assigned it, which is interesting because it takes out the question that always pops up in every horror movie like this at some point when it starts to get crazy. Why don't you just leave? Well, they can't. In this movie, Ball and Rial are a couple that are fleeing a tumultuous and violent situation in Sudan and make an arduous journey to England where they become asylum seekers. Now, although some people are sent home, they're chosen to be further evaluated for possible acceptance into the program, and during which time they're assigned a place to live while their application is being reviewed. Now, it's not the greatest of places, but it is a home. The catch is they're not allowed to seek employment or leave in any substantial way during this evaluation. So not only does that take out the why they don't just leave argument, they also can't seek any help, as any perceived trouble from them might disqualify them from getting asylum and then getting kicked out of the country. So it adds just this extra motivation to not rock the boat, so to speak, which I find very clever. Something else this movie does really well is the overall production value of the film itself. Now, there are a lot of dream sequences here, or at least situations that play out in a character's head, maybe a slightly more accurate. And they aren't just sort of standard, something jumps out at them from the closet. These are very well thought out bits of staging with some nice sequences that took some time and effort to film. I always appreciate that. Going hand in hand is just the overall look and feel of the film is really well crafted. The special effects are solid, and there's some genuinely creepy or scary imagery during some of this movie. Another thing that I appreciated in this film about a haunted house is normally the haunting begins very small, like a freaking cabinet moves. But then by the end of the movie, the ghost or whatever is moving like the entire house or throwing people around or desks or whatever. And that always bothers me. Like, if the ghost has been around for a long time, shouldn't it be at full strength right at the beginning? Like, why does it have to ramp up? Well, in this, it doesn't really ramp up at all. It basically starts right off taking some pretty big swings. Sure, at first there's a few things which are like sounds and some things are kind of moving around, but it sort of jumps into the heart of the haunting pretty quickly, which makes sense for reasons I'll get into later. Also, I really enjoyed the perspectives here on the story. So Ball and Rial flee Sudan and are thrown into a very complex and difficult system while seeking asylum. It's a situation that is tough on all sides. And I thought the writer-director, Remy Weeks, did a really good job showing several aspects of the situation where there's no clear right or wrong, and you can kind of understand where the different sides are coming from. Now, that's the beauty of film or just art in general, allowing people to view something through a different lens than maybe they wouldn't be able to see otherwise. Now, this movie could have been just a straight up one-sided affair where Ball and Rial are victimized over and over again by an unjust system and everyone around them is super cruel. And sure, there is a level of that, but there's also people on the other side, like their caseworker played by Matt Smith, or the doctor who gives Rial a checkup, who are basically just trying to help wherever they can, despite, I'm sure, a caseload that is insurmountable, as well as a permeating feeling of being very underappreciated. It's just an unwinnable situation. Now, of course, personally, this is so far out of my level of experience. I didn't grow up in Africa and immigrate to the UK, so I truly don't understand the hardships these people face while making this journey. Like, sometimes from my side, being just born into the US, it's easy to fall into a lack of understanding perspective, and it seems like an easy answer. Like, well, they're getting a handout, what more can we do? Why can't they just be happy with that? And there are several moments in the movie where a couple of the caseworker employees are annoyed that the house that these people got for free is bigger than their own.
His house is bigger than mine.
Bigger than mine too.
So it's easy to build resentment to that. They should just be happy with what they're getting. However, the way they sort of play with this is by some of the language and the attitude in the way they treat these people. There is a line that's used throughout the movie.
Be one of the good ones.
We are one of the good ones.
And it's said several times. And that automatically creates this tiered system subconsciously where they're being judged almost like a pet or an animal. And Rial sees this faster than Ball does, who would do anything so he can fit in and be one of these people.
You beg them, and then you thank them for the unseasoned scraps they throw us.
And seeing the situation that they're fleeing and the hardships it takes just to have a chance at basic safety is heart-wrenching. Everybody only has one life, so them seeking a safer one for them and their family is understandable. I obviously can't truly understand either situation, but I thought the way they portrayed this, it was done with a level of nuance that stood out to me. As another example of that, there's a scene where Rial tries to leave the house to go to the store and gets lost. She then finds 3 students and asks for help, and they give her the runaround without any sympathy at all. Now, what I thought was an interesting choice here is that these 3 youths are black. And as Rial is walking away annoyed and embarrassed, one of them yells,
"Go back to fucking Africa, man. Only English round here, darling."
Now, what I thought was so good about this interaction by Weeks is this could have easily just been 3 white kids harassing her, and the easy conclusion to jump to is it's racism. They're just simply reacting to the color of her skin. But by having black characters in this moment, Weeks, I believe, is showing that it runs deeper than that. It's not just a skin color. This is a nationalistic or even jingoistic approach where the us versus them mentality is purely a circumstance of where you were born versus what race you were born as. And that's a bold choice. Now, I haven't really discussed too much about the plot here because it sort of rides into spoiler territory fairly quickly. But I will say, Ball and Rial move into this house, and immediately they start seeing bumps in the night, noises, visions, and in some cases, straight up attacks. It's pretty jarring in a good way. And as I mentioned, this does not ramp up too much. At first, it seems like the reason why they have this big house is because it's haunted and nobody wants to stay here. And maybe that's the reason why it's been given to them and it has a haunted past, and these residents that were formerly here are the people that are doing the haunting and are in the same plight as theirs. However, as their backstory unfolds and we see what they went through in order to get here, the specificity of this haunting becomes a lot more clear. It's also where I find most of its problems for me. Now, in order for me to continue, I'm going to have to get into some spoiler territory. If you don't want to hear this, just skip to the conclusion. So, unfortunately, I didn't love the way this story resolved itself. Now, just in case you haven't seen this movie, but you don't care about spoilers, the big reveal is that in order for the couple to gain passage onto the bus out of Sudan and to get out of the country, Ball essentially stole a child and pretended it was theirs because they were only taking people with children on the bus. So they kidnap this child and take her away from her mother. And on the voyage across the sea, the boat overturns and the child drowns. So the haunting that they're experiencing is actually a powerful witch that cursed them and wants them to pay a debt because of the dead child. So the visions that they're haunted with is this little girl, and they're forced to be reminded of the events that unfolded. Now, getting back to something I mentioned at the top of how there were 2 ways that this did something a little different with the trope of being in a new home. The first way is that they were trapped there, but then the second one was the fact that it wasn't the house. It really didn't matter where they went. These ghosts were only there because of them. So it wouldn't have mattered even if they could leave. And I like that. It really is a nice 1-2 punch of the age-old question of, well, why don't they just leave? The way this plays out is the witch tells Ball he must sacrifice himself in order to pay this debt. And the same witch tells Rial she must kill Ball to repay the debt. Now, what ends up happening is Ball attempts to sacrifice himself, but when the witch comes for him, Rial attacks him and kills the witch, freeing them of the curse, I guess. But here's my problem. What they did was pretty heinous, and yet the seeming message here is, well, if you own up to something and accept it, it'll just sort of work itself out. I mean, am I missing something here? True, they are forever living with their ghosts, but they're still living, and it doesn't appear to be malicious at the end. So they kidnap a child, and during that time the child dies, and yet that's the resolution? Also, it seems like Ball was blamed for all of this, or at least deemed to be more responsible for the child than Rial in a major way. Now, I do get that it was him that initially stole the child in the first place, but Rial became complicit by going along. I know we're talking about degrees of guilt here, and clearly he does deserve slightly more of the blame for the initial act. But if someone shows up on your doorstep with a kidnapped child, and you know the child's been kidnapped and do nothing, at some point, you become an accomplice. And yet, the debt that needed to be paid was just his life. And even when the witch goes to Rial, still the debt needed to be paid was his life. Why does she get out of the blame? Like, I understand her having to kill her husband is a kind of punishment, but not as much as dying itself. And then when she's able to essentially draw him out and kill the witch, and by accepting their deeds, all is okay, what about the woman with the actual dead child? Where is her redemption? What does she get out of all of this? Now, I know sometimes horror movies get caught up in the downbeat endings, and I've said before that it's nice sometimes to have a straight happy ending in horror movies, but really, it all just amounts to a resolution that feels like a solid conclusion to the story that's being told. Doesn't really matter whether it's good or bad, upbeat, downbeat, I don't care. I'm fine with either, as long as that criteria is met. And I just don't think this super happy ending fits onto the story that they told. Overall, I found this movie to be fairly captivating in the way its story was told and how it unfolded with some really sharp production design and well thought out ghostly sequences. The acting, cinematography, special effects, and general atmosphere was very well done. It really likes its gray area of story, but I felt like it then pulled back at the end and didn't really earn the ending that it got. I'd give this movie a B, but let me know what you think.